An important battle against diversity, inclusion, and equity ideology has taken a positive turn as the Ontario Law Society elects a slate of candidates who are opposed to social justice reforms within the organization. Could concepts such as common sense and merit finally be returning to the legal profession in Canada's most populous province? I'm your host, B.A. Jarvis, and you are watching The Golden Door. Alright, we're back, and I'm happy to return with some pretty amazing news coming from the legal profession in Ontario. As reported by several news outlets earlier this month, including the National Post, Ontario lawyers score victory for free thought in Law Society election. This week, a slate of those brave enough to publicly oppose the statement of principles the Law Society of Ontario imposed upon lawyers was resoundingly elected. Lawyers 1, Thought Police 0. I often have kind words for lawyers, those I've seen at work and admire, but also in general on how when you're in trouble with your liberty at stake, your lawyer is your best friend. But I don't think I've ever been more proud of them as a group as I am now. This week, after a 15-day election period, a slate of those brave enough to publicly oppose the statement of principles the Law Society of Ontario imposed upon lawyers in December of 2016 was resoundingly elected as benchers, the Law Society's board of directors. The SOP forced lawyers to create, adopt, and abide by a mandatory statement acknowledging their obligation to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion, and required that law firms with 10 or more lawyers or paralegals to complete an inclusion self-assessment every 2 years and publish the results. Lawyers and firms that didn't toe the line were threatened with progressive compliance measures. Now, I will briefly return to how unprecedented and almost miraculous this story is given our current cultural climate, but before I do, I want to provide some quick background on the Statement of Principles and how it came about. The Statement of Principles is actually one of 13 recommendations from a report titled Working Together for Change, Strategies to Address Issues of Systemic Racism in the Legal Professions, which also includes such mandates as tracking and publishing of the inclusivity statistics, as well as professional training on diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. As reported by the Toronto Star in 2017, the origins of the Statement of Principles came down to a 2013 survey question asking lawyers to rate their support for the following statement. It is important to reduce discrimination, but the professional's main responsibility is to the client in making sure they're being served by competent lawyers and paralegals. This is an obviously problematic statement that linked competence to race. It suggests that either you have a competent white lawyer or a racialized incompetent one. Richard had a problem with this right away. I don't think reducing discrimination and being served by a competent licensee is an either-or proposition, but the statement presumes that to be true. When a large majority of white and minority licensees either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed with that statement, it showed Richard you have to start with what our obligations are. So this is a poorly phrased question in a number of ways, and one has to wonder whether they intentionally phrased it in this way in order to achieve a specific interpretation that they were looking for. I do think what this question might be trying to get at is if the most qualified candidate for the position should get it regardless of immutable characteristics, and it seems based on the response that most of the legal profession in Ontario agrees that they should. However, this is inevitably put at risk when your stated objective is equality of outcome and a demand that professional organizations resemble the population demographics of the society at large. Which brings us to the stated goal of the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative as stated by the Law Society of Ontario website. What is the goal of this initiative? The challenges faced by Racialized Licensees Working Group found that racialized lawyers and paralegals face barriers at all stages of their careers. The goal of these strategies is to break down these barriers. The main objectives are to, number 1, create a more inclusive legal workspaces in Ontario. Number 2, reduce barriers created by racism, unconscious bias, and discrimination. And most importantly, third, increase representation of racialized licensees in the professions in proportion to the representation in the Ontario population in all legal workplaces at all levels of seniority. The self-reported racialized population of Ontario was between 23 and 26% in 2011. In 2014, racialized individuals made up 18% of lawyers in Ontario and 34% of the paralegals. The Society will begin to publish their Inclusion Index in 2019. I also want to briefly mention here that equality and equity do not mean the same thing, yet they are frequently used interchangeably by the Law Society of Ontario in their Working Together report as well as their annual report, and while equality is used more often, it's clear by the goals of the initiative that equality of outcome, and therefore equity, is what they're after. It would also be remiss not to point out that whatever barriers racialized paralegals may be facing, they're clearly able to overcome them, as they are already overrepresented by between 8 and 11% within the profession, and I imagine the proportion of lawyers will also be catching up as the older, whiter demographic retires, calling into question the need for this initiative at all. Nevertheless, let's take a look at what happened in the Law Society's elections this month. As reported by the Financial Post earlier this month, this lawyer was determined to stop the Law Society's forced Statement of Principles. Lisa Bidley ran the Stop SOP campaign from her dining room table on a shoestring budget. Something changed in Ontario this month. Most people didn't notice. It happened at the Law Society of Ontario, a body that few even realize exists. The Society had, in 2017, started compelling lawyers and paralegals to state their adherence to the dogma of substantive equality, diversity, and inclusion in order to be in compliance with the requirements of their license. Such pledges have become commonplace. Even university applications now require a diversity statement, and getting rid of them is unheard of. But once social justice ideology takes hold of an institution, there is little to be done. But in a stunning vote by its members, the LSO's compulsory equality, diversity, inclusion statement was rejected. In today's cultural landscape, this is a small but impossible victory, and I could not agree more. This is absolutely, seemingly impossible. The rule, adopted the previous year, requires all licensees to adopt and abide by a statement of principles that acknowledge their obligation to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion in all of their affairs, both professionally and personally. After the debate, a pleasant, articulate lawyer introduced herself. What can be done, she asked, to push back against the compelled speech and authoritarianism at the Law Society of Ontario. This month, that same woman ousted the Law Society's prevailing order and turned the self-regulatory body on its head. Her first attempt failed. In the fall of 2017, shortly after the policy was announced, Bidley and a small group of other concerned lawyers in London, Ontario, put up a website called Stop SOP, Stop the Statement of Principles, to encourage lawyers to resist by refusing to adopt the sort of declaration that the Law Society was trying to compel. Instead, 98% complied, even though the Society had said there would be no suspensions imposed for the first year on those who refused. Still, any fear of losing one's livelihood is a powerful deterrent. Bidley and her small group of supporters were undeterred. Every 4 years, the profession elects 40 lawyers and 5 paralegals as benchers, the quaint name for those who sit on the Law Society's governing body. Who in their right mind would be a Stop SOP candidate? In today's highly charged environment, running against equality, diversity, inclusion initiatives risks personal and professional grief. The politically correct who promote tolerance and diversity are highly intolerant of dissent and diverse points of view. No kidding. Yet 22 courageous lawyers and 1 paralegal stepped forward. We warned them that what they already knew. The backlash from social justice activists would be vicious, and it was. Those of us who were publicly affiliated with Stop SOP were called bigots, racists, and Nazis. If you are against the SOP, then I humbly invite you to go F yourself in the A, said one lawyer in a social media post, and stick your, quote, compelled speech argument there as well. Yes, this and worse from lawyers. We won 22 of 40 lawyer seats, which does not amount to an overall majority on the board once the 5 paralegals and 8 lay benchers are added in. Nothing is guaranteed, but the turning the page of the Law Society is at least now a possibility. Our benchers are not a political party and do not agree on all issues, but we are of one mind that the SOP must be repealed. They also aim to rein in the Law Society of Ontario's ever-expanding regulatory agenda, bureaucracy, and budget, so large now that it rivals the city of Oshawa, Ontario. One defeated incumbent observed that the election was, quote, the first time in history of the Law Society that you've seen a well-organized, obviously well-funded group of individuals run on a slate of a single issue. In truth, there was no well-funded electoral machine. We had Lisa Bidley, her computer, a dining room table, and a team with conviction about what was right. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, there is no limit on what can be accomplished if it doesn't matter who gets the credit. But here's to giving the credit where credit is due. So this brings up an interesting issue with regards to how this event has politicized these elections going forward. For example, are we going to be seeing a coalition of pro-diversity, inclusion, and equity running a slate of benchers in the next election? Are we going to see coalitions forming around different issues? In a way, I think it's kind of irrelevant because I think the politicization of this board has already taken place with no better example than the Statement of Principles itself. So here's a Statement of Principles template from the Law Society of Ontario's website. As a licensee of the Law Society of Upper Canada, which was the Law Society of Ontario's old name, I stand by the following principles. A recognition that the Law Society is committed to an inclusive legal workplace in Ontario, a reduction of barriers created by racism, unconscious bias, and discrimination, and better representation of Indigenous and racialized licensees in the legal professions in all workplaces at all levels of seniority. My special responsibility as a member of the legal profession to protect the dignity of all individuals and to respect human rights laws enforced in Ontario. A commitment to advance reconciliation, acknowledging that we are collectively responsible to support improved relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Ontario and Canada, and an acknowledgement of my obligation to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion generally and in my behavior towards colleagues, employees, clients, and the public. So for some further evidence of politicization, let's take a look at a few short clips from a video produced by the Law Society of Ontario on their Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion initiative.
As a young Algonquin woman who is trying to navigate the legal profession, it hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy applying to law school. It hasn't been easy getting through law school.
There have been a few instances, I'd say, of microaggression. Mistaken for a registrar, a secretary, a court reporter, but never the lawyer.
The word was out there that if you tell employers that you're a minority, that's the best way to get your resume to be put into the garbage bin.
And when my racialized colleagues get up in the morning, they have to put on a suit of armor.
I have to fortify myself literally when I leave the home. Depends on what's on the news cycle.
What can we do to enforce those equity standards to ensure we have that diversity?
The reality is right now the power structures are largely the people responsible for the barriers that the racialized licensees are facing. So the work's going to have to be done at that level first. And in order to do that, people are going to have to come to terms with the problem itself.
We have certain ways of doing things in the law and legal procedure that we assume all came from a good place. When you go to court, you bow and you say certain things, you dress certain ways. We have to ask whether or not it fits with equality as a fulsome concept.
I want to see a panel of judges who are reflective of the diversity of my clientele.
Seeing lawyers with familiar faces, seeing lawyers that resemble who I am at law firms.
We must be diverse and we must all embrace diversity, and I think that will show results over the longer term in how the profession changes its complexion.
In addition, the National Post article mentioned earlier also makes it clear that there were other interest groups running in this election as well. Quote, among the disposed were some of the stalwarts who defended the SOP and, rather delightfully, all but 3 of the 10 candidates the Criminal Lawyers Association had smugly endorsed, noting that the CLA board had conducted a detailed survey and screening process to weed out those whose values and concern it deemed did not align with CLA Think. The press release said that the CLA had endorsed 11 lawyers for the election. Alas, only 10 were named in the release. The CLA was backing, as it said, only those who were strong advocates of the legal aid certificate system, who were opposed to expanding the scope of what paralegals can do in the criminal court, and only those who were aligned with the CLA's stance that we must support the LSO's 5 strategies for equality, diversity, and inclusion. So, the totality of this victory really needs to be emphasized. All 22 of their candidates were elected. They represent the top 10 in the GTA by vote, and 7 of the top 10 outside of the GTA by vote. Here's a few quotations from the campaign itself. Murray Klippenstein, as quoted by the National Post. For all of my adult life, I have worked to advance social justice. Now I am horrified by what my own professional regulator is doing in the name of that same cause. Our regulator was demanding that lawyers and paralegals draft and then obey a set of specific political ideas, both in their personal and professional lives, as a condition of their license. He also wrote what few others dared to say. If lawyers were now expecting to adopt and promote racial representation according to proportion of the general population, as they are, that meant the proportion of some skin colors and ethnicities was too low, and that in turn meant the proportion of others must be too high. And while the authors of these rules no doubt would be quick to deny this plain corollary, the arithmetic truth is plain as a matter of simple logic. Without having the nerve to say so directly, the Law Society is telling us that there are, in effect, too many white Jewish lawyers, for there is no single group that has had more success on a per capita basis in gaining representation in this Ontario legal market. As quoted by the Toronto Star, I believe the Stop SOP slate was elected because so many lawyers object to being told what to think and what to say, Toronto lawyer and winning Stop SOP candidate Chi Kun-Shi told the Star in an email. We do not believe that there should be an ideological litmus test for being allowed to practice law in this province. Independent lawyers are essential in a system based upon the rule of law, and when the regulator takes on the task of supervising the values that the individual lawyer profess, that independence is in doubt. Another quote by Chi Kun-Shi, as quoted by the Law Times News, I believe such requirement is forced speech and forced thoughts contrary to the fundamental principles of the democratic society that we live in, she said. In Canada, Canadians and their lawyers are not required to promote any laws or principles, not even those enshrined in our Constitution, which our courts characterize as a, quote, living tree capable of growth and adaptation to changing social environment. Instead, we respect and comply with the current laws and their underlying principles. However, as alluded to earlier, this fight is far from over. As reported also by Law Times News, still, even with two more lawyers who could be swayed, Stop SOP's 22 seats slate in has the majority of the 40 lawyer benches, but not the majority of all votes in the regulatory body. In addition to 40 lawyers, the Law Society Board also includes 5 paralegals and 8 members of the public appointed by the provincial government, called lay benchers. That total, 53 benchers, means that the Stop SOP teams need a support of 5 more people for a total of 27 total benchers to get the majority vote, or some voters to abstain. I also want to briefly mention this quote in CanadianLawyerMag.com made by Daryl Singer, head of commercial and civil litigation at Diamond & Diamond, who was unsuccessful in his campaign. For those who are unhappy with the new makeup of the convocation, I would point out that there is a silver lining. Many of the big law incumbents were not re-elected, and for the first time in my 25-year career, it looks like the convocation will actually be controlled by lawyers who are sole practitioners and from small firms, which has to be seen as a positive by everybody around. So before we wrap up, some of you may be wondering why gender hasn't been addressed at all so far, as it's normally one of the main planks of any diversity, inclusion, and equity initiative. And a quick look at the numbers can provide some insight. Female lawyers make up nearly 44% of all lawyers and a healthy majority of all lawyers under the age of 49, according to the Law Society of Ontario's 2018 annual report. As men over 50 continue to retire, the legal profession will be increasingly dominated by women. For paralegals, women make up almost 65% of the total members of the profession and dominate every age demographic under the age of 65. It's also interesting to note that there are far less registered paralegals than lawyers. So in conclusion, just a huge shout out and thank you to the entire Stop SOP team on behalf of the Golden Door. You guys are truly an inspiration and are providing people with a bit of much needed hope that this whole ideological wave is finally cresting and will eventually recede. There are 1,000 more battles like this that will need to be won before we're out of the woods, but it's important to celebrate the victories when they come, so here's to you guys. Alright, as always, thanks very much for watching the video. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and until next time, you've been watching The Golden Door.